Well, thank you all for coming. Several months ago, when the now no longer here director of the center visited Stanford, he and I had lunch. We had a discussion about some of the work that we were doing at Stanford. We have a Iranian studies program that is an interdisciplinary program that has a project in economy, it has a project, Festival of Iranian Arts, it has a project with the medical school on the frontiers of science, and he was very interested in what we were doing, and I was very interested in what the center was doing, so he suggested that I come. I came, but he is no longer here, so give him my best, and thank him on my behalf for the wonderful invitation. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for arranging everything. Anna, if she's here, thank you for all the logistics. I taught a class on Wednesday, and I told the students that I was going to go immediately to the airport and come to Sweden, and then I have to go back on Sunday essentially, Sunday morning early. And they said, where are you going? This is a very stupid trip. This is very short. I said, well, I'm going to Lund University, and I have a very interesting TA who's in the political science department at Stanford, a PhD. He said, well, the only way it would make sense is if you are going to Lund University Center for Middle Eastern Studies, because that's the place they're doing the most interesting work on the Middle East in Europe. So that's the reputation your center has among some of the more discerning young scholars on the other side. The paper, I need to also give you a description of where the paper comes from. The paper is part of a book that was supposed to be published last year, December, but I have decided now to delay its publication, to wait and see maybe happier days, less cloudy days, less days filled with Islamophobia, to publish it. My sense is that in the United States, the atmosphere is so poisoned that writing any criticism of Islam, even from a scholarly point of view, only feeds the frenzy, and I certainly don't want to be part of that frenzy. Even if you take an impartial view, as I have tried to do, I think eventually the parts that you are going to invariably offer some criticism might well be abused, and you have never any control. Once a book is out, you have no control on how it's used or abused, and in this context, I thought it's best to wait. It's essentially a part of it's essentially a course that I've been teaching at our university at Stanford for about 12 years now. The course used to be called Islam and the West. It has now been redefined for the last 10 years because I decided Islam and the West was far too broad to something called Iran, Islam and the West. And it's essentially about the challenge of modernity and how Islam has been coping with it. And in doing research for that, I realized that one of the remarkably understudied aspects is the work that two of the most influential Islamists of 20th century and 21st century have to offer on that issue. One, Sayyad Qutb, and the other one, Sayyad Khamenei. Easily the most important, influential thinker of Islamism, and also arguably the most consequential practitioner of Islamism. Khamenei has now ruled Iran for 35 years in some capacity or the other as a spiritual leader for 27 years. Sayyad Qutb is, in my view, arguably the most influential thinker of 20th century and 21st century of Islam. And the fact that there is such a confluence of interest between these two figures, these two very, very important figures, is a novel point to most people who study Iran. I can't tell you how often I have asked Iranian scholars, Iranian political figures, whether they knew that Khamenei has actually translated 4 of Sayyad Qutb's books. How many of you in this audience, some of you are Iranian, know that Khamenei has translated 4 of Sayyad Qutb's books? There is no other human being alive about whom Khamenei has exerted as much effort in translating. Once I began reading the books, I became very curious. How come the Shah's regime wasn't interested about all of this? I called the head of the Iranian security under the Shah at the time, Parviz Sabiti, and I asked him, I said, did you know Khamenei? He said, yes, I knew of him, but we didn't think he was a very central figure. I said, did you know that he translated 4 of Sayyad Qutb's books into Persian? He said, no. I said, can I quote you on it? He said, yeah, well, if it's a reality, you can quote me on it. It is a remarkable fact that a book or 4 books that fundamentally challenge the very assumptions of the Shah's regime were translated, published in large volumes, with no censorship, and the regime apparatus and the intelligentsia, Iranian intelligentsia, from the left to the center, except the clerics themselves, weren't aware that this very, very substantial body of work was done by this gentleman. In everything that has been written about Khamenei, and there's very little that is written about Khamenei, and it's a remarkable fact how little there is written about him. There isn't a single biography of him. There is a very little thin book that is written about him. There is absolutely no mention of where his ideas come from. If you read these translations, you understand Khamenei's politics very well, and you understand virtually everything that he has been saying in the last 28 years, he had said before, and that what he says, whether you like it or don't like it, and I don't like most of what he says, but regardless of whether you like it or don't like it, it is not a haphazard set of arguments. It is very cohesively argued, cogently argued set of propositions that he takes directly from Sayyad Qutb, who is also, in my view, the most cogent argument, Islamist challenge to modernity we have in 20th century and 21st century. So understanding where this confluence is, to me, is absolutely indispensable in understanding the Islamist challenge to modernity. And understanding the Islamist challenge to modernity, in my view, is arguably understanding what is potentially the most serious strategic challenge to the West today. I don't say this hyperbolically, I say this very consciously. I might be wrong, but I'm not being flippant. I think if the West fails to understand this challenge, if the West continues to think that this challenge only can have a military solution, if the West thinks, as Mr. Trump does, that you can bomb the shit out of this, I'm quoting him verbatim, they are profoundly mistaken. This challenge is far more serious, far more substantive, and far more potentially consequential than anything else that the West is facing. And the reason the challenge is serious is severalfold. Modernity is, in my view, and I'll tell you briefly what I understand by modernity. Modernity is, in my view, and has been for the last 2 centuries, the predominant challenge of the Islamic world. The question of what is modernity? Is it desirable? Is it Western? Is it inseparable from the Judeo-Christian Greco-Roman tradition? What role did Islamic societies have in the evolution of modernity? Can you buy into modernity piecemeal? Do you need to reject it outright? These have been the formative questions shaping Islamic discourse, in my view, over the last 2 centuries. if you look at what happened in Saudi Arabia, the emergence of the Wahhabi movement, if you look at what happened in Iran during the Safavid era and the rise of Majlisi and the Majlisi paradigm of Shiite politics, which was essentially a rejection of any effort by Shah Abbas to move towards a more tolerant, more pluralistic interpretation of religion. Rahnama has a very, very good book on this development of Majlisi and how it was essentially the foundational idea for the Islamic Republic. And then if you look at Sayyad Qutb, in other words, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Iran, the three most consequential places, that is the challenge that they think they face. How does and how should Islam respond to it? Second, I think we are now at a very important historical moment, that certain changes have happened that have historical, in some ways, I think, epochal consequences. And unless we understand these together, we won't understand how serious the challenge is. Several things have happened. First and foremost, I think, in terms of the relationship between the Islamic world and the West, something historical has happened. For the first time in 1300 years, there are now more Muslims living in the West than there are Jews and Christians living in the Islamic world. For 1300 years, the reverse was the case. There were always more Christians and Jews living in Islamdom than there were Muslims in Europe and in the United States. Now, there's something like 50 million. That's a massive migration. And it's a massive migration that becomes even more interesting and potentially consequential when it is understood in the context of a second, equally, I think, epochal movement in the Muslim world. That's the movement from the village to the city. Egypt, Turkey, Iran, again, three pivotal states of the Middle East, have seen in the last 100 years a remarkable shift from an agrarian, primarily agrarian, village-based society to an urban society. So you have a second migration of epochal consequences. There's a third migration that has happened, and very few have, I think, paid enough attention to its consequences in the development of an Islamist response. And that's the migration of women from inside the house to the public domain. These are serious consequences. In the West, these things took 200, 300, 400 years, and they were fraught with wars and civil wars and religious wars and dislocations. In the Islamic world, this has happened essentially in the last 70, 80 years. And in that context, in the context of this dynamic change, this new challenge to modernity becomes more important. Two other things have happened that make this challenge more potentially consequential. One is the oil wealth. Saudi Arabia and Iran, as two proponents of this version of Islamist challenge, and Saudi Arabia not because they helped develop the Wahhabi ideology, but because also they were host, not just in Saudi Arabia and then in some of the Persian Gulf states, to the Muslim Brotherhood exiles who came to the peninsula and politicized Wahhabism. But the discovery of oil has meant that this new challenge to modernity has now the capacity to have a global reach, whether it is through Iran and the network controlled by Ayatollah Khamenei. It is estimated that he controls, and gives no accounting to anyone, close to $90 billion. How much of this is spent in proselytizing? How much of it is spent in creating Islamic centers around Europe? Nobody knows, because the books are closed to scholarship. We sometimes see the consequences. It is estimated that Saudi Arabia has spent something like $70 billion be in 15 years in promoting its version of this challenge? This version of challenge. So this has now an enormous ability, this challenge, questioning rationalism, rejecting equality of man and woman is not new. It's not new to Islam, it's not new to Christianity, it's not new to Judaism. In the past there were movements like this in the Islamic world. What is new now is that this movement has all of this capacity, this wealth, all of the potential soldiers for it in these massive dislocations that have happened in the last century. And then, last but not least, it is happening in the age of social networks. Radical Islamists are extremely good at using social networks to proselytize. We know of ISIS as the most, by far, effective. One of my students did a study, is a wonderful, brilliant student who came to Stanford, then went to start a startup company in Silicon Valley, became very rich, and then came back to finish his work. So he knows the ways of the startups. He wrote a paper, and I think he's going to soon publish it, on how adept radical Islamists are in using social networks. How adept they are in getting free publicity. His estimate is that ISIS had $11 billion worth of free publicity in 1 year. If ISIS was a corporation and was trying to get name recognition, it's $11 billion worth of name recognition. Forget about whether it's good or bad. They wanted their name out. They wanted to be ahead of the narrative, and they write about it. So all of this is happening in this moment. So it's, I think, a very, very important moment that this challenge is happening. Both Khamenei and Qutb were emphatic that this change is going to happen, that this historical change is going to happen, that this is not a minor event. Those of you who follow Khamenei a little bit, Khamenei has been for 25 years, particularly the last 15 years, talking about what he calls piche tarikhi, a historic turn. He says we are at a moment where there's going to be a historic turn. If you listen carefully, if you read, the historic term he's talking about is an Islamist challenge to modernity. So what do I mean by modernity, and what does this confluence of view between these two imply? As Kolakowski says, there are as many definitions of modernity as there are people who use the concept. Some of you, I know, might have read some of the stuff that I've written in Persian, for example, on modernity. I've written 3 books on modernity, 2 in Persian, 1 in English. And the concept and the arguments essentially in them is that, first of all, modernity is different than modernism, and modernity is different than modernization. In all too many discussions, these are taken to be interchangeable. They're not interchangeable. They're profoundly, in my view, different. What I'm talking about is not modernism, which is essentially an aesthetic form, an aesthetic set of innovations. It is not modernization, which is an infrastructural set of changes. But modernity, which in my view means a set of interrelated changes in economy, politics, religion, epistemology, and aesthetics. In economy, obviously, it's the move from a feudal economy to an urban economy. And again, the reason this moment is very important is that the dislocations created by globalism, the dislocations created by rampant capitalism, uncontrolled capitalism, Reaganomics, the inequality that is becoming increasingly problematic throughout the capitalist world. The fact that a Harvard translated book of a French economist on inequality becomes a bestseller in America and sells 250,000 copies. A book filled with arcane econometrics models tells you something, that society is at its end in terms of the dislocations. So the economic of modernity is in crisis, and both Qutb and Khamenei are very good at using these things. But they use the economic, I think, this issue mostly to attack the other four components. I talked about 5 components. The economy, which is essentially a market economy. In political terms, modernity is about Rousseauian social contract. It's about citizens. It's about people becoming no longer subjects, but citizens of a state. It's about legitimacy no longer being divine, but the result of a social contract. In religion, it means religion is essentially, in the modern society, the relationship between the individual and her or his God. The state is no longer responsible for oversight. Religion essentially becomes part of the private domain. Contrary to what Khamenei says, contrary to what Qutb says, modernity doesn't necessarily fight religion. It certainly simply says religion is a matter of a private relationship between the individual and his or her divine, and it is also the right of the individual not to have a divine. The right not to have a religion is as important, as sacred as the right to have religion. In terms of epistemology, it's probably the most important aspect of all of this. Thomas Kuhn says it's the most central element of modernity, and that is the advent of rationalism, the advent of empiricism, the advent of certain form of doubt, the notion that doubt is essential to a scientific methodology, that there are pluralism of facts, that there isn't one truth, there isn't one text, there are multiplicities of text and there are multiplicities of truth, and there are different ways of finding this truth, and that this truth is not in a book, this truth is not revealed, this book, this truth, these truths must be discovered by human beings, and are thus contingent truth. Contingent truth, as Richard Rorty famously argued in his book, doesn't mean alternative facts, as some of Trump's supporters say. Contingency of truth means truth, but truth that is limited to the horizons of our time. But that is essentially the epistemology of modernity. In terms of aesthetics, again, a very important point of departure is that in the modern era, what is beautiful is to be determined by what the artist thinks is beautiful. Neither the church, nor the state, nor the market has the right to tell an artist what she or he can consider to be beautiful. The market cannot buy the book, the church can issue a ruling against it, but it can't kill the author, and it can't limit the right of the author to create that kind of a. There is a rise of a kind of a humanism. One could say that the story of creation in the Sistine Chapel probably best captures the modernity's humanism, the ability to give a physical manifestation and a human manifestation to God, the ability to put God on par with the divine, and as the title, the creation of Adam. It's not clear whether God is the creation of Adam or Adam is the creation of God. The ability to ask these kinds of questions, these kinds of fundamental questions, is essential to the aesthetics of modernity. This constellation is what I mean modernity to be. And it's a constellation that is based on individualism, it's based on skepticism, it's based on empiricism, it's based on human liberty, it's based on the notion that nobody knows the truth. We can all partake of the truth. we can all participate in attempting to understand this truth. And that no one has an absolute monopoly on religious truth or any other kind of truth. If we accept this to be the essential paradigm of modernity, there are debates about whether this is essentially a Western paradigm. Eurocentric scholars have argued that this is essentially something that was created in the West and belongs to the West. I don't buy that argument at all. I think if you look at, and I can discuss this in detail if you have any interest in it, if you look at the history of Iran, for example, which is a country that I've been most interested in, from the 9th to 13th century, many of the ideas that we think of as quintessentially Western modern ideas, many of the ideas that we think of as essentially and quintessentially Renaissance renovations and innovations, are in their budding form being experimented with in Iran. If it is true that Renaissance to a great extent means the rebirth of Aristotle and the rediscovery of Aristotle in Europe, well, much of that rediscovery came to the Europeans through Islamic sources, through Iran, through Avicenna, through Farabi. Without them, this Renaissance, and many others. There's a wonderful book by a Harvard scholar called From Baghdad to Florence. It's about the rise of the laws of perspective in painting, which is essential to the Renaissance art. And the argument is that without physicists in that part of the world, Renaissance perspective laws would not have been developed. So I don't buy this is the argument that this is Western. Two groups have been incidentally making the argument that modernity is Western. The Eurocentric narrative and the Islamists. The Islamists too have been saying that modernity is undesirable because it's inseparable from the Judeo-Christian tradition. The Westernizers, the Eurocentric, have been saying that if you want to be modern, you got to dress like the Westerner, talk like the Westerner, go to bathroom like the Westerner, you sit like a Westerner, and Taqizade's famous phrase, that to be modern means to become in our bone and blood Westerner. I don't believe that for a moment to be the truth. And I don't believe that for a moment that modernity is the gift of the West to the world. Modernity is a human moment of evolution. Different societies have at different moments contributed differently to it. The Islamic world has not for the last, as Khatami famously said, for the last 500 years made any contributions to it. And as it began to fail to make contributions to it, one response was to reject it. That's the Islamist response. That's the response that I want to talk about. And specifically, I'm not going to talk about Majlisi, which is equally one. I'm going to talk about this rather remarkable two individuals who have written these sets of books. Sayyad Qutb has written them in Egypt, and Khamenei has translated them in Persian. And they offer a very interesting alternative view of what. Now, I kept asking how much the audience would know about some of these things, and it's very difficult to guess at how much you know, for example, Sayyad Qutb's life, or how much you know about Khamenei's life. I'm going to assume that you know some things, and if I bore you with details you already know, I apologize. If I don't give you enough information and there is more you need, I'll be glad to provide it in the question and answer period. There's some interesting similarities between these two. Sayyad Qutb, for those of you who don't know him, is arguably the most important theorist of radical Islamism. He is the most influential theorist of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is by far the most significant radical Islamist group in the Islamic world in 20th century and 21st century. And to give you a sense of how off the West was in understanding the significance of this, till a few years ago, there wasn't a single biography of Qutb in the English language. 12 years ago, when I began teaching this course at Stanford, I wanted to use Qutb's book, Milestones. It's one of the most important books he has written. The only place I could get it at the time, the only place that had an English translation of it, was a Syrian publishing house. It is now available in English. There are a couple of biographies of him, well-written intellectual biographies of him, but still, the level of ignorance about his role and about his ideas, I think, is remarkable. So he's an Egyptian who has a very unusual early life. He is deeply immersed in Quran. By some accounts, he knows the whole of Quran by heart by the time he is 10 years old. And those of you who have studied in the Islamic world or know the Islamic world, you know that memorizing the Quran is a very coveted feat. People take great pride in it. Some people know it by heart without knowing a word of what it means. There is a competition about how you can remember it. I once was in Egypt and was watching the competition of 10-year-olds, seeing who best remembers the Quran by heart. Well, Qutb was one of those people. He knew the entire text from at the time he was 10 years old. But then he has a conversion of sorts to a westernizing intellectual tradition. He becomes a westernized intellectual. He becomes very interested in modern literature. He begins to write literary criticism. And apparently he's very good at some of it. I haven't read those. But then gradually he goes back to a more Islamist view. By early 50s, he is completely convert. He travels to the United States for 2 years. They send him to the United States in the hope of the Egyptian government, apparently in the hope of moderating his views. He comes to the United States and becomes even more of an Islamist. And the account that he has written about his travel and the places he goes is Washington, Colorado, and San Francisco. He visits Stanford. I've looked at Stanford archives. There's no evidence of what he did there, but he was there. What he has done, I still don't know. But he goes back absolutely convinced that America and the American way of life embodies the failure of humanity and the failure of modernity, the bankruptcy of the church, and the degradation of the human being. I mean, the book, if you read it, is remarkable in how someone can visit America and see a very different reality that many other people would see. And then he begins to become a very important part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And then he writes in prison. He spends 15 years in prison. In prison, he writes a famous tafsir Quran, Quranic interpretation. Writing a Quranic interpretation is sort of a rite of passage for those who want to become well-known Islamic intellectuals. The entire depending on how they have divided it. Some would say it's 30 volumes. I've seen 30-volume versions. There is an 8-volume version. The entire thing is fortunately available in English now, underwritten by Saudi government, available for free download online. So if you want to understand how he understood the Quran, all you have to do is go online. There's a site called Kalamullah, the word of Allah, and it has a lot of these things. And you also have a chance to see a lot of other Islamist texts in English for free, for download online. And the fact that all of these texts are now available online, I think cuts both ways. It's one way to propagate them. But it's also interesting to see 20 years down the line how availability of these texts impacts the youth. If actually you read what these people have to say, some of these more traditionalist texts, what they have to say about the world, what does that do to your religious disposition? In Iran, if Iran is any measure, the fact that these books are now readily available has essentially secularized Iran in ways that Iran has never been secularized. The generation that many of the Iranian students in the audience are from, I think, is arguably the most determinedly secular of any generation that I certainly know of. And then he is eventually executed by Nasser on charges of complicity in an attempt to assassinate him. There is no evidence that he was actually complicit. It seems to be a made-up charge, but he becomes a very important figure. As exactly in this period, about the time where he is assassinated, another young cleric, remember Sayyad Qutb is a Sunni Egyptian. Another cleric in Iran, with all the tensions that exist between a Shiite Iran, a Shiite Iranian Muslim, and an Arab Sunni intellectual that exists, by the name of Sayyad Khamenei, begins to get interested in Sayyad Qutb. He begins to translate his works. The first thing he translates from him is one part of his Quranic exegesis. And I'll talk about this in a minute. It's called In the Shade of Quran. That's the name of Sayyad Qutb's book, and Fi Zilal Quran is the name of that Khamenei has chosen for his translation. It is a remarkable work, and it's a remarkable translation. And if somebody wants to write a brilliant master's thesis, I can suggest if you speak Persian, English, and Arabic, a comparison between Khamenei's translation, the English version, and the original is going to be very, very revealing. I've done occasional checks, and it's fascinating how they have modulated, how in the English translation they have moderated the text, and how Khamenei has radicalized the text. Very interesting. I haven't done a full comparison. I did a sort of anecdotal check, and I think somebody should do this. So Khamenei comes from a poor family in the city of Mashhad, a very religious city. Used to be religious, but the Guardian of London just wrote a whole article that Mashhad, the famous religious city, is now a center of prostitution. That many of Iraqis go to Mashhad for what essentially is a form of a short-term sexual contracts. And it's also Mashhad, one of the most conservative cities in Iran, is also one of the centers for Iranian underground rap. Music is banned by Mr. Khamenei as the work of the devil. In his city of birth, the underground rap music has its own school. The Mashhad school of rap is in its own school. So the Mashhad of today, after 37 years of rule, is very different from the Mashhad that Mr. Khamenei was born in, and very different from the family he was born in. He was born into a poor family. His father was religious. They lived in a very small house. Radio was banned because his father didn't want the work of the devil in the house. He was deeply immersed in Quran, like Sayyad Qutb. He also had, like Sayyad Qutb, a deep interest in modern literature. He begins to associate with groups of intellectuals in Mashhad, some of whom are very, very famous. Shafi'i Kadkani. His idol, it's a remarkable fact, this rather fundamentalist leader of Iran, his poetic idol is Akhavan Salis. a poet who has written more about Zoroastrian grandeur and more about criticism of fundamentalism probably than anyone else. But even as of 2 years ago, Khamenei was still so enamored of Akhavan that he published on his website a couple of paragraphs that Akhavan had written saying, this young cleric who's interested in literature has asked me to write something in his book, and I write this. And it's a very sort of flippant thing that Akhavan has written. But he was very interested. And he is very good in translation. His translations are extremely efficient. They're at times elegant. Every place, I haven't compared all of them to the original. Every time I've done sort of sample checks. They're very, very accurate. And he has written extensive commentaries on these. He goes on to translate 3.5 of them. And I say 3.5 because he begins translating the 4th book. He's put in prison. He asks his brother to continue. As some of you again might know, he has several brothers. One of them is extremely conservative, and one of them is a reformist. The one who is a very conservative, Muhammad, is the one who finished the translation, and you can clearly see that he's a lesser of a translator. He's clumsy in his language, and the commentary that he writes doesn't have the cogency of Khamenei's own translation. So he translates 4 of these books. There's no one else that he has translated. There's one other thinker of whom he has translated 1 book. There's nobody else that he has translated 4 books from. And by far, there's no one else who has had as much influence on him as Sayyad Qutb. He himself says in one of his pieces of memoir that his political ego ideal, was an Iranian Islamist by the name of Nawwab Safavi. Nawwab Safavi, again, in one of those cases where the Iranian intelligentsia, the Iranian critics, the Iranian regime, this intelligence agencies of the West, so far as we know from what has been declassified, were completely oblivious to how important this guy was. Khamenei says, I became political because of Nawwab Safavi. How many of you have ever heard the name of Nawwab Safavi? How many of you have read his manifesto? How many know he wrote a manifesto? Nawwab Safavi has written in 1946 the most detailed manifesto criticizing the Iranian regime and offering a plan for every ministry in the government. And this is a guy, Khamenei says, most influenced me in my life. This is a guy whose group, Fadayan Islam, killed more prime ministers and important political figures than all the leftist groups put together. If you ask 90% of Iranian historians where the guerrilla activity or terrorism, whichever you want to call it, began, they say Fadayan Islam, Mujahideen Khalq. Fadayan Islam and Mujahideen Khalq are small fry compared to what Fadayan Islam did. They tried to kill the Shah twice. They killed 3 prime ministers. They're the ones who killed Khasravi. And when they killed Khasravi, they issued a fatwa almost exactly like the one that Ayatollah Khomeini issued 70 years later against Salman Rushdie, saying we are not going to allow loose artists, in the case of Khasravi, loose tongues, criticize Islam. There's another fascinating connection. Nawwab Safavi travels to Egypt in 1951. And one of the people he meets with is Sayyad Qutb. The way of cross-pollination of ideas in this hitherto undiscovered territory is truly, I think, remarkable. So the four books it translates, I'm running out of time. My introduction became a little longer than my. So why don't I say a few words about the four and what their fundamental critique is, and then we have a discussion. I think that might be right. Or you want me to stop now and open the discussion? Okay. Essentially, let me first of all say a few words about the introduction of the Quranic exegesis, because I think that's very important. Khamenei chose to translate the first part of this tafsir. And the tafsir of Quran goes from the beginning to the end. Sayyad Qutb. All of the chapters of the Quran are line by line analyzed by him. Those of you who have read the Quran would know that after the brief introductory chapter, the longest chapter of Quran, Baqarah, is essentially about the relationship between the Prophet and Jews. Historically, moderate Islamists have consistently tried to make the argument that whatever the Quran says about the relationship of Muhammad with Jews refers to the political battles of that time. They're not anti-Semitic. If Muhammad says in the Quran that Jews can't be trusted, they poison the minds of Muslims, what Muhammad meant was that this is the tribe that he was fighting at the time. Sayyad Qutb does the exact opposite. And Khamenei does even more. Every time Sayyad Qutb is less than totalizing in his critique, Khamenei in the footnote says, he's wrong here. The language is remarkably anti-Semitic. And the fundamental premise is that modernity is a Jewish creation. Because it is Jewish creation to begin to convince Muslims to move away from their only source of salvation. They meant to move Islam away from salvation. At the time of Muhammad, they did it by fighting him directly. And then they began by offering these false idols, as he calls them, false idols. And the biggest false idol of them all is modernity. Modernity, he says, in this, is the second fall. In the first fall, humans moved away from divine guidance and were thrown out of heaven. In the second fall, tempted by primarily Jews, but then also by Persians, Persian philosophy, Zoroastrianism, Western classical philosophy, Renaissance ideas, he mentions all of these. They were convinced that human reason is a better guide than divine wisdom of Allah. And the reason they did this is that they wanted to undermine the Islamic power. They wanted to betray Islam. And at every turn, it's remarkable. You're sort of, as you're reading, you're trying to tell Sayyad Qutb and then Sayyad Khamenei, don't go down there. This is a very dangerous anti-Semitic path. Take the more limited one. Give yourself the option of saying these are historical references to the relationship at that time. Now, remember, he is writing this in the aftermath of this creation of the State of Israel. So he has a lot of anti-Israeli venom that he needs to get out. And the argument that oftentimes is made by those who want to apologize for the anti-Semitism of some of this rhetoric and the anti-Semitism of some of what Khamenei has been saying is that, no, these are not anti-Semitic, these are anti-Zionist. You read this, I think it is very difficult to buy that argument. There are criticism of Israel there, but this goes far beyond that. It goes to a fundamental critique and a fundamental rejection of the historical role of Jews. The second thing that happens there, that is again fascinating in light of things that have been happening in Europe, in light of what happened in Denmark, in light of what happened in France, is that Sayyad Qutb says, and Khamenei repeats emphatically, that the Old Testament and the New Testament are all essentially fabricated texts. That Jews and Paul and other Christians essentially changed the words of God, and what we have as the sacred book of Christians, the sacred book of Jews, is a fabricated text. If you take this kind of liberty with the religious texts of others, and incidentally, there is a lot of historical evidence to suggest that, yes, there was what we have as the Old Testament and the New Testament aren't really God's words. There's a lot of human intervention there. I fully understand that. But if you take the liberty of making these points and considering, for example, the Old Testament and the New Testament fabricated text, you must then allow the same liberty for scholars to say the same thing about Quran. They can dish it out. They can use the scholarship to undermine the sanctity of other people's sacred texts, but the moment you have the first question about whether a single word in the Quran might have been changed by the editors who put it together, it's sacrilege. It's a kind of double standard that has gotten us to part of the problem that we now have. 50 million Muslims living in the West, many of them getting this notion that anytime you question the absolute historical sacred composition of Quran, the minute you begin to talk about how was the Quran actually edited, who did the editing process, were there parts that were omitted, that is sacrilege. But you can take that liberty and much more with the sacred text of another quarter of humanity. I mean, it's just as wrong for that crazy priest in Florida to be burning the Quran as it is for a Muslim to say bad things about the sacred text. If you live in a liberal democracy, if you live under the aegis of modernity, you should have equal freedom to historicize religious figures. The problem is now, they can historicize almost everything they want, but the minute others begin to historicize Islamic figures, then they're bordering on the most important failure of the Muslims, he says, and Khamenei repeats often, and Khamenei repeats also in a book that he composed himself, which is directly influenced by Sayyad Qutb. He taught a series of Quranic interpretations in 1972. This was composed into a book, and there you could clearly see he is taking his cues from Sayyad Qutb. And the fundamental ideology in that book is very much the fundamental ideology in Sayyad Qutb. And that is that Muslims have the only sacred, complete book of salvation. Quran is God's last iteration of his sacred book. It is the most complete. And Muslims have the fortune of having, for the first time and only time, have a community that lived by Allah's laws. That's Islam during Muhammad and his 4 successors' time. That golden period is what Muslims must go back to. That's where the word Salafism comes from. That Salafism is as common to Khamenei's view as it is to Sayyad Qutb, as it is to Wahhab. Actually, if you really look into this history, the history of the Islamic period, particularly after the death of the Prophet, is a period fraught with an enormous amount of conflict and bloodshed. The notion that there is some golden unity, that the four caliphs first lived together and ruled by Allah's divine rules, is simply not true. And even in Iran today, under the most strict censorship, some scholars are writing remarkable books, articles about this. If any of you are interested in this history, I strongly urge you to read Mowahhed's last 4 articles published in Bukhara. They're absolutely brilliant. They're all based on Islamic texts. And they basically show what a troubled time the first 40 years, the golden age, is. So Muslims have a golden age where they ruled by absolute divine laws. And that is what they need to go back to. Modernity is the second fall because it cut that connection with that divine source. Let me stop here and see if you have, I'm sure you have questions or comments or complaints.